Okay, today is Wednesday, January 18, 2012, and this is the first class of Children and Justice. We've just gone over the Blackboard page, which included the learning modules, the learning projects, and the discussion boards. We went over using the Cyber Cafe rather than email. We went over the lecture page and my policy on lecture posts. And now we're going to start a little bit into Learning Module 1. One of the objectives of Learning Module 1 is to get you to appreciate how important words are in the justice system, how important language is in the law, to appreciate how precise definitions of child abuse are critical in determining jurisdiction, what kind of case it is, what kind of court hears it, what are the rules of that court, policy, investigative response, case outcomes, and even responsibility for doing something wrong or to neglecting or abusing a child. The words that describe child abuse and neglect and sexual assault, the words that form the statute, which is a word for law, the words of the law are critical. In determining lots of different things about how a case proceeds. The problem with laws and statutes and the problem with the justice system, in part, is that it relies upon these things called words, these placeholders for ideas. The reason why we have lawyers, the reason why we have people represented when they enter a business agreement, or when they enter a marriage, or when they are sued in court or charged with a crime, if it was as simple as picking up the book of laws and reading it, then we wouldn't need lawyers. Everything would be crystal clear. You simply look at what you're charged with, turn the pages of the book to that section, and you know what the heck you are accused of doing or not doing. But it's not that simple. Because words are inherently ambiguous. Language is inherently ambiguous. Words are capable not only of two meanings, but of a myriad of meanings, of lots of different meanings. Words and the context in which they are presented in a law or in a legal context can have a lot of different meanings. Words are highly nuanced. Phrases are even more complex. And we need to appreciate that and understand it. That doesn't mean that there aren't some things that are clear, that in some aspects the law and the statutes that make up the body of law are clear. They can be clear. Nevertheless, we need to think about the law and the law as it governs children in our course as something that is capable of many interpretations. And sometimes is not a model of clarity. To illustrate that, I'm going to start a little bit ahead of ourselves here and take a look at State in the Interest of MTS. Now, this was a New Jersey Supreme Court case in 1992. And you'll read it. It's among your assignments that you need to read for next lecture. But I'll give you a little preview. This case involved what the court called, and what is commonly referred to in the popular media these days as acquaintance rape. And it had significant ramifications for dating, violence, acquaintance rape, and any kind of sexual aggression. Now, it involved juveniles. It was a juvenile prosecution. It was a 17-year-old boy and a 15-year-old girl. And although they had engaged in some kissing and fondling and sexual conduct, at some point the girl fell asleep. And the boy had sexual intercourse with her while she slept. Now, I forget, we need to look at the case again, whether she was roused from her sleep or not. We have to read the case again. I need to read the case again. But the case involves a sleeping victim. Now, here's how words come into play. In New Jersey, it is a crime to commit an act of sexual penetration with another person by force or coercion. That's one crime involving sexual assault. There are a variety of them, and we're going to look at many of them next class, or maybe a little bit this class. But just to take you into the world of this case called State in the Interest of MTS, one of the ways to be guilty of sexual assault is to commit an act of sexual penetration with another person by force or coercion. The law said that in 92, and it says that in 2012. If you look closely, you'll notice that this law, like all laws, is made up of what we call elements, different parts. I'll say it again. It is the crime of sexual assault if a person commits an act of sexual penetration on another person by force or coercion. So you need a person and another person. If it's a dog or a tree or a dead person, it's not sexual assault. It might be something else disgusting, but it's not sexual assault. Right? Because these are the words. I'm trying to emphasize to you that we are bound and married to the words that make up the law. Even if we think it's bad and we think it's wrong, we think it ought to be punished, if the words weren't drafted precisely and accurately, it ain't a crime. Okay? It's not actionable. So, if we deconstruct a statute, in this case the sexual assault statute, we can chop it up into its elements or constituent parts. A person, it is sexual assault if a person commits an act of penetration upon another person by force or the disjunctive, or, not and, or coercion. So usually the person part's pretty easy to solve, right? Pretty rarely do we have dogs and trees and dead people. But one element is person commits an act of penetration on person. So those two elements, person and person, are pretty unambiguous. Penetration. What does that mean? Well, there's a definition. It is whatever the legislature says it is. Now, we may have a average person, in the law we call average people. You know, if I didn't have a law degree, just you and me, we're lay people. L-A-Y, lay people. You may hear me use the word lay people. That means a non-professional, a non-legal professional, a lay person. You may have a lay person understanding what penetration means, and it could be very close to what the law says about penetration. Close, but not exact. There is a special definition for penetration. And we'll take a look at that, what that means in a moment. So you need a person who commits an act of penetration upon another person. by force or coercion. All right, those are elements too, right? It's not penetration in and of itself. One of the definitions of penetration is sexual intercourse. That seems reasonable, right? The insertion of the penis into the vagina is what sexual intercourse is. That requires penetration. That seems reasonable. So if we're talking about sexual intercourse, and we have two people engaged in it, it's not a crime. Right? It's only a crime if all the elements are met. Well, we have a person, penetration, another person, not a crime, force or coercion. So, what is force or coercion? Well, a lay person might say, well, it means if you threaten somebody, if you scare somebody, if you pull a gun or a knife on somebody. And I'd say, yeah, that makes sense. And we'll use the man and woman hypothetical a lot here. There are women who sexually assault men. They're rare, but they are out there. There are certainly women who sexually abuse boy children and girl children. They're out there. But they pale in comparison to the men who rape women and sexually exploit female children. Pale. So it's far easier to use that model, that example, because that's what the vast majority of these kinds of crimes involve. But I want you to appreciate that I am not naive and I'm not picking on men. It's just that that's what the vast majority of sexual aggression involves, men against women. Exactly. In any event, so a man who penetrates a woman with his penis, who pulls a knife in order to do that, who pulls a gun, who threatens her, who scares her, who punches her, who holds her down, who claws at her, who does whatever. That's an easy one, right? That seems forceful, that seems coercive. Or if you don't have intercourse with me, I'm going to kidnap your son, or I'm going to burn your house down, or I'm going to terrify your husband, or I'm going to whatever. That seems coercive, right? It doesn't have to be actual force, because it says force or coercion. Let's go back to MTS. You haven't read the case, but I told you what the facts are. A 17-year-old boy hooks up with a 15-year-old girl. They're kissing, they're groping at each other. It's all consensual. Right? It's not even a crime. 17 or 15 is okay in Jersey. They crash. They go to sleep. She's sleeping. He puts his penis inside her as she sleeps. I don't remember what the case says. He ejaculates. He doesn't ejaculate. It ends. She wakes up in the morning or later or is rousted. I forget exactly the case. Somehow, after it's over, I don't think she woke up. Maybe. It ends somehow. Well, let's see. Is he a person? Yeah, he's a 15, 17-year-old boy. Is she a person? 15-year-old girl. Is there penetration? Yes, with his penis inside her. Is there force or coercion? Now I'm asking you. The girl's sleeping. He puts his penis inside her. And then I'll change the facts. Maybe they're the same, but let's assume that she wakes up the next morning. And we have these cases. I woke up, my panties were off, I had no pants on, he was laughing and saying, hey, what's up? That was great last night. What was great? You know, you get these, unfortunately, on campuses and all the time. So this is very real, this dynamic. In this case, this was two kids. I think they were in a foster home, actually, if I recall. But nevertheless, she wakes up. I've changed the facts, perhaps. And she believes she's been penetrated. And she has. He thinks everything is cool. Have all the elements been met? We have a pair of persons, we have penetration. Is there force or coercion? What do you think? Why? Where's the force? Okay, she didn't have the option. That's about choice. I want to know where he forced her. Where? What force did he use? Did he have a gun? No. Did he have a knife? Did he threaten her? Did he coerce her in any way, imprison her? Did he say something to her before he had sex with her when they were awake to make her scared? Feel coerced or forced? Where's the force? Where's the coercion? Now look, we may feel that what he did is dastardly and wrong and exploitive and vile and unacceptable, ought to be criminal. But if it ain't a crime, it ain't a crime. One of the things that you'll learn throughout this semester is that we're a state that relies on the criminal code, upon laws. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. All of the laws in this state that govern criminal behavior need to be in the, maybe this is a book, need to be in the criminal code. Criminal code's about 400 pages, and it says what you can't do without getting punished. Usually go to jail. If it ain't in there, it ain't a crime. There may be something that's done by someone that's despicable and disgusting and exploitive and bad, but if it ain't in there, that guy who did it today is not in trouble. We may learn from him or her and pass a new law that says you can't set fire to trees where you know birds are. I don't know. It's an act of cruelty. We as a society may hear about a situation and say that guy ought to be in jail, but if it ain't in the book, it ain't a crime. And where there's ambiguity, where the law is unclear, right? The outcome is always in favor of the accused. And the reason that is because as a government and as a society, we have chosen to be what we call a notice state. That when we accuse and prosecute someone of a crime, it has to be posted. It has to be written somewhere. There has to be a way in our country to know what you're not allowed to do and what you're allowed to do. Otherwise, we would be in the situation that our forefathers were. We would be almost medieval. You know, in the old days, if you lived in England or France in the 17th century, the 16th century, they'll haul you in and prosecute you for something that you never even knew was an offense. I didn't know that was wrong. Well, it is. Now it is. And you did it, and you're in trouble. That's called ex post facto. You can't pass a law today that punishes behavior that happened when it was not punishable, when it was legal. You can't pass a law today that criminalizes or punishes or makes illegal something that happened yesterday. You can only pass a law that makes something illegal from here on, starting now. And that seems fair, and I embrace that. That makes sense. I don't want to live in a society where they say, you know what? Guys who listen to their iPads in the library have to do 30 days in jail. These iPads are obnoxious. People use them and they annoy other library patrons. And you did it yesterday, and today we're passing a law, you're going to jail for 30 days. First of all, how could I ever conform my behavior? If the law is about getting people to do what's right and discouraging them from doing what's wrong, if it's not posted somewhere, if it's not written somewhere, and if it's not clear, how can I conform my behavior? How can I know what I'm not supposed to do and what I'm supposed to do? How can I do what's right? Now, I went to the library with my iPad because I thought it was okay. Had I known it was wrong, I wouldn't have done that. So we live in a society now where the criminal law is posted somewhere, where it's written down. It gives people notice, and it's fair.
that people know what's wrong and right before they engage in behavior. To say something is wrong today that someone did yesterday is to be arbitrary. We can do whatever we want then. We could put anybody we want in jail in this country if we operated that way, right? Everybody we find distasteful, everybody who's a member of a minority, everybody who protests or objects or occupies Wall Street, we can put them in jail today for something they did yesterday, if that's the way we govern ourselves. But we don't. That's not this country. This country operates on the system of notice, that there's fair warning. So we'll pass something today. We'll get you tomorrow. We'll go after you. But we can't get you today for what you did yesterday. Taking that concept a little further. Okay, so we're going to write a new law. You're not allowed to have computers in the library between 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock. Okay, I go in there with my iPad, there's this law. We're locking you up for having the iPad. For what? Possession of a computer in a library. This is not a computer, this is a tablet. It's not a computer. All I do is check my email on that. That's a computer. Well, maybe it's a computer, maybe it's not a computer. But the people who write the laws, the burden's on them to be clear, right? The burden's on them to be precise. If there's ambiguity or uncertainty, it would be unfair to resolve it in the favor of the government. Because then we could say, well, we didn't quite say tablets or cell phones or iPod touches. But we meant that. Oh, really? That is just as arbitrary and just as unfair as not having a law at all and making it criminal today for something you did yesterday. Well, we wrote down computers, but we meant transistor radios too. Well, that same kind of process can be used to harass people and to punish people. Well, we said you can't sleep in Zuccotti Park. We also meant stay in one place for 8 hours, and that's tantamount to sleeping. That's not what it said. It said sleeping. I wasn't sleeping. I've been up for 24 hours just laying on this, what do you call it? Sleeping bed. Sleeping bag. I never slept. I've been up for 24 hours. Well, when you could change the meaning today to capture behavior yesterday, you can be arbitrary. You can distort the law in a way that is unfair, in a way that allows the government to go after unpopular people. So the law needs to be precise. The other reason is, if we're going to hold somebody accountable for being ambiguous when they write the words of the law, it ought to be the person who writes the law, not the person who the law applies to. Why? Why would we say, you know what, the person who writes the law, which is the government and the legislature, right? The police, as represented by the legislature. If they write the law in a way that's unclear or ambiguous or imprecise, then the guy ought to go free and the government ought to write the law better. It's going to be construed, or we're going to decide this against the government and for the accused, for the little guy. Why is that a good policy besides it protects us from an arbitrary government? A government that exploits us for past behaviors that were not criminal or clearly expressed. Why is it, that's one thing I just said, but it also is a good idea to decide against the guy who actually wrote the bill or wrote the law or typed it up. Why do you think that's good policy for the future? What do you think that encourages the next guy who writes law? Go ahead. Say that again?
Room for improvement?
Who's going to be improving?
The next guy who rewrites it or edits it?
Yes. Why? Why would that? You're absolutely right. That's what I'm driving at.
For future purposes or something that
They will be more likely to be more...
clear.
Exactly. This is a concept that's relevant in contract law as well. It's not only the criminal law. In fact, the
It's really contract law where you get this saying. They call sayings in the law maxims, M-A-X-I-M. Just means saying. Just means saying. But a maxim in the law is that ambiguities are construed against the drafter. Drafter is a fancy word for the guy who wrote it. Ambiguity means when something's not clear, it's capable of multiple interpretations, multiple meanings. So when you're unclear and you wrote it, we're gonna decide it against you, the guy who wrote it, so that you're more clear next time. Next time you'll be more precise. You're the one who's writing it. The burden's on you to be clear. The burden's on you to be precise, not the person who's getting all the way to jail. Well, I didn't know force or coercion meant sleeping victims. Well, that's what we meant. Come on, man, she's sleeping. It's terrible what you did. It's outrageous. Woman's got a right to sleep in peace and not be penetrated by another man. That's true. I get all that, but you want to put me in jail. You're going to jail. Why? Because you forced her. I didn't force her. The lawyer for MTS, who was the boy juvenile, would have argued to the judge, and I'm sure he did or she did, Judge, look, what my client is accused of doing, and they'll say accused, they're never going to admit that he did it until the time is right or circumstances compel that way to express it. The defense lawyers can say, look, Judge, my client is accused of something that I appreciate this court finds abhorrent, that this court finds distasteful. My client is accused of something I find distasteful. My client is accused of something that's outrageous. My client is accused of taking advantage of somebody when they were sound asleep. And it probably should be a crime. People ought not be able to do that and get away with it. The problem is, Judge, and you know this, that when he did it, it wasn't against the law. The legislature may have intended that, but they didn't express it that way. There's no evidence in what they did or what they wrote to conclude that they meant that he could be guilty or responsible for having sex with somebody when he didn't force or coerce them. There's not a scintilla, a shred, a little piece of evidence. There's not a little piece of evidence that shows he used any force or that he used any coercion. Now, this court may conclude that the legislator meant to say, they meant to say, without permission or without consent. That may be what they meant to say, but they didn't say that, Judge. And the next guy who does that, he ought to go to jail. But my client is not guilty of something that was a crime when it happened. And you can't send him to jail for that. There are reasons for this. I just went over them with you, right? There are reasons why we are a nation of laws. There are reasons why we require notice, why we must be informed of what's right and wrong. There are reasons why this is a statute which requires that we are told what's right and wrong so we can conform our behavior. And that simply is not happening in this case. There's no force, there's no coercion. And I agree with this court, the legislator ought to change this statute so the next guy who does something like this ought to be held responsible. We're not admitting this happened. But if it did, it's simply not a crime. We think the legislature has to go back and fix that statute. But it doesn't apply to my client. Now, I'm sure she said something like that. I don't know. In any event, the Supreme Court of New Jersey didn't agree with what I just said. What they said was rather interesting, and it turned the sexual assault law on its head. And it really flies in the face of what force or coercion means. There's no other way around it. This has nothing to do with the dictionary definition of force or coercion. What I suggest that lawyer may have said is true.
There was no force and there was no coercion in this case, MTS, at all, in the classic sense. It wasn't there. The Supreme Court really took those two words and stretched them as far as they could be. Stretched. Nevertheless, there's some wisdom in their opinion. Here's basically what they said. Well, if you go back and look at why we passed this law in the first place, it used to be called carnal knowledge or carnal abuse back in the 50s and 40s and back in the day. Rape. There's no rape in New Jersey. People love using that word. It's highly charged. Got a hard P in it, man. People like rape. So we arrested a teacher for having sexual conduct with a student today. I wouldn't be surprised if Bergen record points. Teacher, rape student. There is no word rape in our law. Back in the day, it was carnal knowledge, carnal abuse, and they may have used the word rape. In 1971, in this state, they changed the book of laws, and they called it sexual assault. So what used to be rape or carnal abuse is called sexual assault. And it recognizes that this is assaultive behavior. And the Supreme Court said that. They said, you know what, when we changed this law, we changed it. We, the state of New Jersey, changed it. The legislator recognized that these acts are assaultive. They are sexual expressions of violence. So they're sexual. Those who say this is an act of sex is an act of violence, that's not right. They're sex. Rape is sex. Sexual assault is sex. But they involve violence and coercion. So the court said, listen, we changed the law in 1971. It's now sexual assault. And the other thing we did when we passed this sexual assault law, what we said was the victim does not have to resist anymore. At all. And no mention of her resistance is appropriate. It used to be in the state of New Jersey and in other states, some southern states, as recently as a few years ago, that women had to resist to the utmost. So if you were a victim of a sexual assault or a rape, of sexual aggression, and a man was forcing himself on you, had to fight, kick, scratch, and if you didn't do that, we're not sure if we believe you. It is okay for jurors to consider whether the victim fought back. And even years before that, if the victim didn't fight back, you couldn't charge. You couldn't charge. If there was no evidence that the victim fought back, there could be no complaint for rape. Out the door. Then it changed to evidence of resistance was relevant. They even got rid of, they must resist to the utmost. But resistance was still relevant. Now, you can still get into the courthouse door without resistance, but they could say, well, she didn't resist. And the judge would read instructions to the jury. You may consider the fact that the victim did not resist in concluding whether these allegations are true or not. At the end of every criminal trial, the judge has to tell the jury what the law is. And one of the things they used to tell them was, if they didn't resist, not quite this way, if they didn't resist, then it may not have happened. Well, we dumped that, man, in the 70s. That's BS. That has no relevance. That is a vestige of medieval times. It really is. But it lingered throughout the 20th century in New Jersey and in some southern states up to the 1980s. But the Supreme Court and MTS said, you know what, we got rid of that. We got rid of that because we knew better. We got rid of that because we knew that women who fought back got hurt more. They were more likely to be injured and killed. So it is okay to engage in a tactical surrender. A tactical surrender means if a man is attacking you, you could not fight back and you could simply be assaulted. You don't have to fight back. That's what they call tactical surrender. So there may be situations where there's no force at all. Let's not forget the statute says force or coercion, right? The court said if we interpret the terms force or coercion to mean extrinsic force, the word extrinsic means additional force. A knife, a threat, a gun, punch in the nose, then we will be writing back into the law that victims have to resist. Because if guys who rape women have to use violence, if that's an element of the offense, if one of the elements is penetration with violence, how do you measure violence? How do you prove, if you're the prosecutor, how do you prove violence in a rape case? If that's an element, you say, Judge, this man raped that poor woman. He penetrated her, element 1. He's a person, she's a person, element 2 and 3. By force. We say he forced her and coerced her. And we're going to put evidence on it. What's the evidence typically going to be? How do you, if you got a man and a woman and he raped her in a stairway of an apartment building, how would you look for force? How would you prove that element of force? Yeah, so if we're going to be looking for bruises and scars and injury, what are we introducing back into the equation? How do you get bruised or scarred or injured? By struggling, fighting back, scratching, trying to get away. If a victim simply freezes or engages in a tactical surrender, then they're not forced. To interpret force or coercion any other way would to bring back resistance and fighting back. And we scrapped that a long time ago as an anachronism, a leftover from another time, from the days of kings and queens and knights and chastity belts and all kinds of misogynistic behavior by people and men and governments and societies. We scrapped that in 1971. To say that force or coercion, in this little case involving a 17-year-old boy and a 15-year-old girl, requires extrinsic force, guns, knives, punches, threats, would be to take us back to that day. We're not going to do that. We decide today, Ms. Schwartz, we decide today that force or coercion means no extrinsic force. Extrinsic means guns, knives, extra force. It simply means the absence of the freely provided and affirmative permission of the victim to the act of contact or penetration. Force or coercion means a non-consensual penetration. Because when somebody puts their body parts into another human's body without their permission, it is inherently forcible. Right? So they didn't scrap force or coercion. I overstated it a bit before. They said, no, there's force. When you put your penis or your finger into another human's body without their permission, that's forcible. That's force. No greater force is needed than the act of penetration itself. That's the force. Fascinating case. Anyway, we got to go. I got to go. I got a little carried away here. We'll look at this case in more detail next week, and we'll try to draw a few lessons from. Remember, this started out about words, right? About words and what they mean and how to interpret them in the law.